Hey guys, today I'm going to be showing you how to make this Bowie knife using the stock removal method, and the metal which I'm going to be using for this is going to be a Farriers Rasp. So you might be thinking, what is a Farriers Rasp? Well, a farrier is a person who trims and shoes horse hooves, and this is the rasp which they use to do that, and the rasp is used for removing whatever metal they use in the horseshoe, so subsequently it's got to be very hard, very tough, and very long lasting. But because it's being used on metal, they wear out quickly, and the farriers have loads of old blunt ones which they don't use anymore. My friend has got horses, so he needs a farrier to come round and fix horseshoes up every now and again, and he gave him loads of these Farriers Rasps, and he was kind enough to give one of them to me. The reason that I'm using a Farriers Rasp is because they are very, very hard, and they've been hardened a lot, so the edge of this knife should last for a very long time. So if you don't know anyone who has horses and you don't know any farriers, you might be able to buy some of these off the internet for quite cheap. Also, you could use other types of metal, and in the past I've used stuff like circular saw blades, they work quite well, or old files if you have any large enough files. As you can see, this knife is very sharp, it easily passes the paper test, and it's also pretty good for chopping things. So let's see how you make the knife. So to start off, I need to start shaping the rasp into the shape of the Bowie knife which I'm going to be making, and I'm just sort of going for a classic design. You can just do this in any shape of knife, it doesn't have to be a Bowie knife. I'm just picking this design because it's quite classic and I haven't done one before. Since, as I've mentioned before, the Farriers Rasp has already been heat treated and it's very hard, you don't want to ruin that heat treat because you want to use that for the heat treat on the knife blade unless you want to reheat treat it. So as I'm going to be constantly quenching it in water so that I can regulate the temperature and make sure that it doesn't get too hot. Shaping was simply done with a grinder and an angle grinder. First I had to shape off the blade, and then I cut out the shape for the tang as well. Just a very long thin strip that's going to be long enough to embed itself in the handle. And then took it home and it was onto my belt sander where I was going to be flattening out the teeth on the rasp. I used a combination of my belt sander and a flap wheel on the angle grinder to flatten out the teeth, but I still kept the pattern. I didn't want to grind them out completely because it would make the blade very thin, and I still think that the pattern looks quite nice. So this is what the blade looks like after I've done some of the grinding and taken off all of the teeth. I think it looks pretty nice. I'm still going to leave this nice pattern left behind by all of the different rasp teeth, and I quite like it how it's asymmetrical and it's not the same on both sides. I think now it's time to start grinding the bevel. So to grind the shape of the blade, first I need to find the very center of the blade where I can make the two grind marks meet. To do that, I take just a regular Sharpie pen and cut all of the front of the blade in. Then use a pair of digital calipers to measure the thickness, and it's about 4.8mm on this steel. Surprisingly enough, I actually had an exact 4.8mm drill bit, so then I clamped that to flat on my bench, and then you can drag that backwards and forwards over the blade and it'll leave a scratch in the ink which you put on earlier that will be exactly in the centre of the blade, and you can grind both of the bevels to meet that scratch. To start off the grind, I decided to use my angle grinder just with a flap disc again, since that removes material quite quickly and with not much effort. I then moved on to my belt sander, and since this metal is so tough and hard, it used up a lot of belts pretty quickly, but it was worth it since the knife came out pretty nice in the end. The most important thing when grinding a knife bevel like this is just to hold it at a constant angle and keep that angle going all the way down the blade, and then try and do the exact same angle on both sides, and although you might not get it the first time, as you practice you get better and better at it. Another very important thing is to make sure that you are constantly quenching the knife blade, because that would ruin the heat treat and you don't want to have to reheat treat this later since it's quite a large knife, and that's the whole point in already using the Farriers Rasp. Since this blade is quite large, it doesn't heat up very quickly while I'm grinding it, but if it ever gets to a temperature that's just too uncomfortable to touch because it's too hot, I then quench it until it's completely cold again in water and carry on grinding. So this is what the edge looks like after grinding. It's pretty sharp, it meets in a nice blade right in the middle, runs all the way down the entire blade, and as you can see it's even. I've tried to make it the same angle on both sides and I think it worked quite well. So now I've got the edge ground and I've got pretty much the shape that I want. It's time for a little bit of differential heat treatment. What I've got at the moment is this is super hard and it's also pretty brittle. I want the blade to be this hard, but since I'm going to be using this for chopping and quite a lot of impact, I don't want the spine to be this hard, and since the spine doesn't need to cut anything, I can soften it and make it more flexible so it's much less likely to snap the entire knife in half. So if I just place it in this like this, then I'm going to fill it up with water, and then I'm going to heat up the spine so that it'll soften slightly and ruin the heat treat, but the water will cool down the blade so that that doesn't lose the heat treat. It will probably be a good idea not to use half of a plastic bottle as the container, since it's not very heat resistant. This should be a little bit better, and I've also got the blade submerged a little bit more just so that I can heat up the spine. What you're looking for is the spine of the knife where you're heating up to start to oxidize and turn a bluish tinge as it's heating up and slowly tempering. You don't want any of that bluish tinge to travel onto the knife blade though, and that's why we're keeping it submerged in water so that stays nice and hard. In the end result here, you can't really see it very well because I accidentally sanded it off before I videoed it, but it was all nice blue along the spine and none of it was on the knife blade. Before I move on to the handle, I need to flatten out the tang a little bit more. At the moment it tapers too much and it would be quite annoying to shape all of the handle scales to fit that, so I just wanted to flatten it out so that it was all the same thickness. So now I've got the shape of the tang all sorted out and it's ready to make a guard and a handle for it. So this is the guard which I'm going to be making. I'm just making it out of a piece of aluminium. It's shot here because I shot it to see how much it would penetrate, but it's flat over here still, as you can see. And I've just scratched in the design of the guard and I've basically made a square in the middle so that it'll fit in like this. Aluminium's probably not the best choice of material for a guard. Some sort of steel would be better if it was going to be functional, but I don't really need that. I'm just going to be going with aluminium and it'll be good enough for me. So for cutting out such a small piece of aluminium, I'm just going to be using hand tools. Just use a combination of a large hacksaw and metal files. And I'm going to try and make sure that it's symmetrical, just doing it all by eyeballing it. Then using a 4.5mm drill bit, I'm going to start to cut out the square in the middle just by drilling 2 holes on either side. And then this can then be enlarged just by using some small files. Once I've cut out the guard and it's roughly symmetrical, I can then slide it onto the tang of the knife like this. Goes up against the edge. Now it's time to solder it in place. So the soldering was a bit of a failure, but I'm going to include it anyway because I learn from my failures and I'm sure a lot of you in the comments will show me how to fix this failure, and also you can learn from the failure. The way that I tried to do it at first was I was just trying to melt the solder directly onto the tang, and this wouldn't work because the solder just wasn't sticking to anything. I then thought, oh, it needs a bit of flux so that I can make sure that no oxide layer builds up, so I wire brushed it clean and applied a bit of dry borax flux. But that didn't really help at all it did was just build up a load of gunk of borax that just blocked the solder from even reaching the metal. I wire brushed it all clean and then tried dissolving some of the borax flux just in some water and applying it like that. Then when I applied the heat, I would try and boil off the water and just leave the solder and the borax flux in the right place. But then that still didn't work. It seemed like the surface tension of the solder just wasn't sticking to anything. I'm not sure whether the problem was that I was using the wrong type of solder, or it was 2 different types of metal, or the wrong type of borax flux, but I'd really appreciate if you've got any help on this. So that really didn't work at all. None of the solder really wanted to stick to any of the metals. Maybe it's because this is 2 different types of metals, or maybe this is just normal soldering for electronics and I need something like silver solder, which I don't have. Alternatively, I could have welded it, but I don't really have the means to do that right now, and also this is aluminium going to carbon steel. That's not going to work. I'd appreciate any help that you've got in the comments section down below, but I've just decided that I'm just going to glue it on with arrow dye on this side, and then it's going to be held on by the handle so it shouldn't move too much. I decided before I put on the guard that I would buff it so that it's shiny, so that it has a nice look. Now I'm starting to shape some pieces of wood so that they're the same shape as the handle guard, so that I can slide them onto the tang of the handle, glue them in place and shape them to be the handle. This piece of wood is going to be the first piece, and this is made of some mahogany. So this is the way that the handle is going to work. So first I've got the guard, which you've already seen, then I've got this piece of mahogany wood which I cut and did the groove into, and that fits up against the guard. Now I've got this piece of purple heartwood, just an offcut from some wood turning lathe wood, and then that will also go on there like that, and those will both be glued in place, and that sort of builds up the front part of the material. For the second part of the handle that's going to be sort of out to here, I'm going to use something more solid, so I want to try and use some of this laburnum wood. This is quite fresh, so it's quite cracked, didn't really dry out very well, but I can just fill those cracks with glue, and it's got a really nice grain. And this is just from an old tree. This is just obviously the center of it, and this is just from a friend who got their tree chopped down and was nice enough to give it to me. So first I had to shape the laburnum wood into shape, and this was already quite a large piece of wood and I wanted to only use the heartwood, so I just had to remove all of the big pieces just using chisels and other hand tools. Once the large log had then been shaped down into a smaller, much more manageable piece in a square, I could then drill a large hole for the tang to go in. I needed to make sure that this was the right size so that the tang would still fit in with a lot of friction so that there wasn't any room to move about. After that's done, all of the pieces of the tang can easily be assembled just like this. So this is what all of the pieces look like once they've been assembled. You can just pull them off because this is held in by friction. This is the hole that I drilled. I had to enlarge it slightly either side, and it's got lots of room to be filled with glue. And speaking of glue, it's now time to glue all of these pieces of wood into place. To get the tang ready for gluing, I used an angle grinder to cut lots of notches and slots into it so that the glue would grip much better, since it's got a lot more surface area and fresh metal to grip onto. Then using a 2-part epoxy resin, I covered the tang and the handle and all of the different pieces of wood in all of the glue, and then used excess and then put it all on. I used clamps attaching to my bench vise to compress everything. So overnight the glue has now set, now it's time to get shaping the handle into shape. Again for this I'm going to be using hand tools. I'm going to be using wood saws, wood rasps and wood chisels. For the shape of the handles which I make, I never really have a set design in mind. I just think of something that would look quite nice. Occasionally look up some handles on Google Images, but mostly I just hold the handle, see which bits dig in and then carve them away until I end up with a nice looking handle that fits my hand really well. Once the rough shape of the handle has been complete, even though the knife is still really blunt, it feels nice in my hand, and when I chop things, nothing digs in. So this is what the handle looks like after I've finished shaping it. It's very rough shaping, but I think it looks really nice at the moment. The contrast between some of the colours is really nice, and that will only be brought out once I oil it, but now it's time to move on to sanding, and I need to get rid of all of these deep scratches left behind by the wood rasp. For removing all of the deep scratches, I use a combination of metal files and rotary sanding drums. Once all of the deep scratches have then been removed, it's time to sand it all the way up to 600 grit, just using wood sandpaper and sanding sponges, so that it feels really nice and smooth. This is the handle after sanding. I think it looks pretty nice. Now it's time to oil it, just with some boiled linseed oil, in order to protect it from water damage and also to bring out the grain. After oiling, I think the handle looks really nice, and it's really brought out the grain in this wood here. It's then time to move on to sanding up the blade. I've decided that I'm not going to sand it up to a mirror finish because I don't think that would suit the knife, and I'm just going to be sanding it up to about 200 grit, but it still makes it quite shiny since this metal is so tough and hard. So this is the knife after I've finished sanding and sharpening the blade. As you can see, I haven't made it very shiny. I could have done it all the way up to a mirror finish, but it's not really quite required, because for this I'm just going to be using it for chopping, and it'll just get scratched up pretty much straight away, no matter how tough the steel is. And I've also sharpened up, and I'd say that it's pretty sharp. Obviously it's not going to be razor sharp since it doesn't need to be, and the edge wouldn't really hold up to that very much, but it's easily sharp enough to pass the paper test. I also do plan to build a sheath, but this will be sometime in the future. I'm not going to do that today since I haven't had a video out in a while, and I really need to get this video done. So there will be a sheath tutorial sometime in the next couple of weeks, hopefully. So now it's done. I think it looks really nice. Now it's time to go and test it out, see what it can chop and see what it can cut. So I started off just chopping through some small things just to see how sharp the blade was and see how tough the handle was. As a final test for cutting things, I tried to cut through one of these plastic bowls, and as you can see the knife didn't get through because the plastic bottle bent and flexed and sort of folded itself around the knife, but you can see how much impact I put into it, and I was actually worried that I was going to break the knife, and you can see how much it really hurt my hand just from the bouncing off of the knife, but it shows how strong the handle is. This didn't at all damage the blade of the knife or weaken the handle. So that's all for today. Thanks for watching, guys. I really hope that you've enjoyed this video. Post any comments down below on what you think I could improve on this knife, and also how you think I could do the soldering process if you've got any idea on how to do that. Also post any comments down below on any future projects that you want to make, and even though some people don't believe me, I read every single comment that I get because I get them through emails on my phone and read them as I get them, and I'll make an effort to reply to most of the comments.